Now, this might seem fairly intuitive because I think all of us do this without necessarily, calling it a process or going through each step, something we have acquired over the years. Is there another way of approaching this? I'd like to share a very interesting template, which is called the job task inventory. So this is something which helps us to approach designing a blended solution in a slightly more scientific way, if I may use the word. So basically, what it does is for any job, you break it down into the core tasks. And for each task that the learner has to learn, you decide, you analyze how frequently is that task performed. If the task is very frequent, then I think it's fairly important for the person to learn it and through a full-fledged training. So if it's very frequent, you approach it through training. If it's not at all frequent, the task that the learner does, you could probably just, give them performance support or give them some resources which they can access at their point of need and so on. So the other parameter is how important is the task. Now, if it's something very important, training, full-fledged formal training is the best way to do it. And if it is not that important, then you could just, once again, as I said, you could just probably just send information through an email or offer performance support. Now, what happens when the learning is very difficult to acquire? The complexity of learning. Now, when in situations where the learning is very complex or where it's difficult to learn something, again, a full-fledged training is best, which could be done through the classroom, followed by support through e-learning. Now, where the learning is not very complex, for instance, regular compliance trainings and so on, you could just leave it at e-learning. Now, the other parameter is that of risk. What do I mean by that? Uh, if you break down the job into various tasks, and some tasks are very risky. So, what do I mean by that? The consequences of not doing a certain task lead to risk, either to a person's life or to property or to somebody else. So that would constitute a task involving a high degree of risk. For instance, when you're operating extremely complicated machinery, which if the learner is not very sure of how to do it, there is a danger of losing even a limb or performing surgery, for instance. That's a high risk uh, job. So when you have a situation where the risk is high, where the risk of not doing something well carries is very high, then you would want to have something which is totally classroom, where you have a lot of opportunities to give the learner practice, sufficient practice to be able to master that skill, and where the clarity of consequences are very clearly demonstrated to the learner. Of course, when the risk is low, it could be e-learning. The format you take could be e-learning, and you could support it with performance support. So I'll very quickly take you through how this matrix looks like when you apply it to a certain um, job. So this is the actual template actually. So you have your job and then you break it down into the tasks and then you decide for each given task. We would recommend taking just two or three main core tasks on which you are actually focusing all your training budget and your effort. And then you go through this, you decide whether it's how frequently this task is, how important it is, how difficult is it to learn, what's the degree of risk associated with it, and you fill it out. For instance, if that given task is high on all the four parameters, then the best option would be to have an actual training, a demo session, practice, live coaching, ongoing feedback, and continuous assessments. And where the leader, there's an expert who mentors, and the coach is the one who's actually responsible for assessing the competence of the learners, and where the clarity of consequences are very clear, and where you also use e-learning to further elaborate on certain situations, because e-learning gives you the time and the space to really mull over something, situation based learning scenarios, and it actually gives you a very good chance to remedy your uh, whatever wrong information you have, or wherever you're doing something not so competently. So with its format of feedback and ongoing remediation, it lends itself very well. Now, what do you do when you have a job task which okay, here are some more items, which are listed here. When you have development time, and where you need, some social aspect of it, this is when you would use uh, for a job that's high on all parameters. These are some of the things you would use. Now, what do you do when you have a task which is low on all of these parameters? Which format do you think would work best? Which does it call for a full-fledged blended learning solution? I think the answer to that is pretty evident, that one wouldn't want to waste our precious training resources on something that can be just uh, addressed through performance support. So in such a case where the task is really low on all of these parameters, I would just go in for communication, self-study, and I wouldn't want to have either e-learning or classroom. Now here's a example of a task where it's a blend. On some parameters, it ranks high. For example, it's quite frequent. It's not that important. It's probably a routine thing, a routine task that the learner performs. The level of complexity of learning is a little on the higher side. And then you have the risk. So in such a situation, I would just make sure that the solution I've put together addresses the learner's need just in time by giving them access to just about whatever resources they need to be able to handle that. And then I would go in for a bit of formal training through maybe classroom or e-learning, and I would of course supplement it with performance support.